I call Todd Muller.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I rise to take a call on the Environmental Reporting Bill, particularly Part 2. And can I just start by acknowledging the comments from Chris Farfoy, obviously and express condolences from this side of the House to his loss, and obviously an advocate for the Tokelauan community. With respect, though, to the specific SOP that he raised, I certainly hold the view that the priority of this bill is quite rightly New Zealand and should remain New Zealand. And so the various impact categories that the various synthesis reports and domain reports are to cover, as expressed by Part 2, should quite rightly be focused in on New Zealand. I do, and so in that respect, I'm not swayed that we should, at this point in time, widen the scope in terms of the enabling legislation to the Pacific Islands and the broader South Pacific community. That said, Mr Chair, I think over time, as the various synthesis reports are produced every 3 years, who's to say that those synthesis reports might not in the future talk to the interrelationship between the New Zealand environmental position and those of our Australasian and Pacific neighbours, and that may well be part of a synthesis report into the future. Mr Chair, specifically with respect to Part 2, a couple of points that I would like to note. I appreciate there has been some conversation from members of the Select Committee on this already, but it was, I think, the changes to Clause 7, particularly around providing clarity on the specific impact categories that came from our Select Committee deliberations was useful. The previous section, Clause 7, 1C3, which had economic benefits derived from utilising natural resources. I think it was quite right that submitters in our collective deliberation pointed out that this was the only category that referred to benefits, and the new wording that we have in that clause is more neutral, just specifically saying that the economy needs to be one of the categories considered. And also the introduction of Te Ao Māori, the Māori worldview, which again reflected significant feedback from the submitters during the process, that the language that the original bill had perhaps wasn't quite as comprehensive as it needed to be to capture that particular component, and of course the new proposed wording we are all pretty comfortable with. Mr Chair, I noticed Clause 8. Very good to see the change there with respect to the first synthesis report now being required to be published not later than 3 years after the date of the first domain report. That makes sense. Further on in Part 2, we have a clarification around the timing with respect to the first domain report, and then that triggers the requirement within 3 years to have our first synthesis report. So I think that is very useful. So too has, under the domain reports in Clause 9, Part 2, I think the introduction of a requirement as soon as reasonably practicable after the Secretary and the Government statistician have published a domain report for the Ministers to have jointly reported to this House. I think that is also a very helpful addition in terms of transparency and public awareness of the outcomes of these particular reports. Mr Chair, in terms of Clause 13, we had quite a long debate and discussion and assisted ably by officials helping us through this particular challenge around the roles of the Secretary for the Environment and in particular the Government statistician, and the requirement to ensure independence of those two through the environmental reporting framework. We had quite a lot of debate about that, Mr Chair. A number of submitters wanted to explicitly mandate that the Government statistician and the Secretary for the Ministry for Environment had to seek expert advice. I think that what we have got here does enable the Government statistician to be able to seek that advice. They are able to utilise Mr Chair, Mr
Todd
Chair,
Muller.
expertise from other agencies, and I feel that, that certainly they have enabled through this proposed bill the capacity to be able to get the information that they need. And it's certainly my view, Mr Chair, that Clause 14 and the rather explicit duty to act independently provides the adequate safeguards to protect independence for both the government statistician and the Secretary of the Environment. Mr Chair, we had a significant debate over Clause 16, disclosure of information, and as you can see, as the Select Committee has deliberated, we have a significant change with respect to that clause. Essentially, there was a long debate over the ability for us to be able to, or the ability to be able to disclose information and analysis to the public, and whether that was an open right and obligation all through the process. Clearly, we felt that it would be appropriate to have some part of the process, particularly around untested information, that needed to stay protected as they tested their methodology and tested the ultimate conclusions of the report, that there was a requirement for that definition of untested information to stay outside of the public domain as the reports were being developed. I think that's a sensible way through. It focuses just on data and statistics and findings that have not been published previously, and it does create, I think, the opportunity to protect the independence and integrity of environmental reporting, and doesn't hinder access because, Mr Chair, this untested information is of course time-bound, and once the publication ultimately becomes public in the public domain, then of course the release of that background information is then enabled. So this is a particular subset of information that is required to be kept out of the public domain as it is part of pulling together that final report with the integrity and robustness that it's required. Mr Chair, my last comment relates to Clause 18. I appreciate that there has been quite a lot of debate about this, but I'd like to add my voice to that. Clearly, a number of submitters opposed Clause 18 as it's outlined. We've heard some very strong and impassioned views that ministers setting topics is incompatible with independent environmental reporting. I'm not swayed by that. I wasn't at the start, and I'm not swayed still. In my view, it is absolutely appropriate for ministers to be able to hold a view on the topics for these reports within the tight parameters of the clauses that are listed in Clause 18. The topics are outlined. The robust and data and statistical methodology is outlined, plus there is a significant requirement for consultation. And a view that somehow that is an environment for an overt politicisation of the process, I'm just simply not swayed by, Mr Chair. And if you move to the specifics around particularly around the topics, the ministers must be satisfied that the pressure topic or impact topic affects significant areas, resources and numbers of people, that the topic can be measured with robust statistical methods, and the pressure topic is closely related to any state topic. In essence, what this is saying is that we have a framework that, in my view, materially constrains a minister to be able to focus on signing off or proposing a topic within that framework. And bearing in mind that both the Ministers for the Environment and Government Statistician, the Minister for Statistics, has an obligation under this to consult with the government statistician, the Commissioner, the public, iwi authorities and local authorities. That is a very robust obligation on the executive to consult widely on what those topics should be, and I have a lot of confidence that ultimately we will get an outcome here that is sensible and delivers a significant improvement to the reporting on the state of environment in this country. And in conclusion, Mr Chair, it is worth repeating that this is another step of reform in a government that has delivered significant reform in the reporting of the environmental state in this country, enabling us to have an informed, data-enriched discussion.
I call Eugenie Sage.